Hello.
Okay.
Whoops.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Daniels faculty for our second to last event for the fall semester. My name is Robert Levitt. I'm the acting dean, for those of you who may still not know. But before we proceed, as we always do, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So thank you all for being here. There will be one more event on our public programming for this semester. It's the Master of Visual Studies and we will host it next Tuesday on November 25th, and we will have Peter Morin, whose artistic offerings are organized around 4 themes: land knowing, Indigenous grief and loss, community knowing, and understanding the creative agency and power of the Indigenous body. So that's next Tuesday. And just to let you know about next semester, the new year, we will post a more comprehensive list of our programming for the new year soon, but we will kick off on January 16th with Professor Mason White's one-day symposium called At Home on Ice. His design practice, Lateral Office, of which he is a co-founder, is the recipient of numerous awards and recognitions for projects co-led in Canada's Northern Territories, not to mention the many other laurels that the firm has received. So more details to come in our upcoming e-newsletter. So on to tonight's event. We are pleased to welcome Alfredo Caraballo, a partner at Allies and Morrison in London, UK, and working here in Toronto. Alfredo has worked on projects around the world, from Beirut to Milan to New York, and here in our very own Toronto. His work and expertise on questions of urban design will contribute to the important perspectives he brings to bear tonight in a lecture on the role of tall buildings in the formation of cities. Alfredo is going to ask a number of, I think, questions that are important to all of us Torontonians who have seen the incredible growth of the city through the use of tall buildings, and we'll pose and perhaps answer questions about what is good design for tall buildings in cities. We're all familiar with the impact of tall buildings, and the question is whether we are champions or skeptics of them, that they are, we all must agree that they are challenging forms of architecture in making our cities. So the questions are, how should tall buildings land in the city at the ground? What sorts of adjacencies should arise between tall buildings and their neighbors, perhaps other tall buildings, mid-rise and lower-rise buildings in the city? Does height matter? What are the crucial questions that help tall buildings to operate positively in the urban context? Can they make good neighbors, really, which is the final question? And can they become a part of the fabric of the city? The question is, when we ask what can they become part of the fabric, what do we even mean by fabric or good fabric? So I think that Alfredo will help us to navigate many of these questions and provide us some thoughts on solutions. Alfredo is a partner in charge of international projects, as I mentioned, at Allies and Morrison. He's a central voice for their Toronto work and designs for new neighborhoods in our fast-growing city. He's a native of Caracas and studied at the Universidad Central de Venezuela and the London Metropolitan University. He has taught for several years at Kingston University and has held lectureships and critic positions within British and Latin American universities and lectured widely across North America and Asia. He is also the co-chair of the International Council of the Van Allen Institute in New York and sits on the Lambeth Design Review panel. So at the end of the presentation, as you all probably are familiar, we'll sit together. I will start with some questions and turn to the audience for some more. So without further ado, please, with applause, welcome Alfredo to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go back a little bit. Thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Very delighted to be part of this lecture series and talk about this small challenge of how to do good neighbors and good places with tall buildings. And going to try to run more or less agilely and fastly through these hundreds and hundreds of slides. But first, I'd like to introduce some aspects in relation to these challenges and these funny numbers that refers to 3 scales and 3 types of interventions when we are talking about tall buildings. And we always talk in the office, what are the key challenges of these elements that come with rapid urbanization and the dilemmas that then we find with the sort of the growth of urban population and urban places around the world. And it's interesting when you start working in different latitudes in different places, how some of the problems that you find in one place are common in other places. Perhaps obviously the cultural manifestation might be slightly different, but there are problems that are relatively similar. So many places seems to be designed with not so many people in mind, but with cars in mind. And that seems to be universal, seems like transport engineers. And we have friends that are transport engineers, have a free reign pretty much everywhere. Places are becoming increasingly homogeneous, increasingly generic, and then you don't know if you are in Asia, you are in Europe, you are in South America, and so on. So because similar types and similar type of language and similar type of responses happen everywhere. And obviously, with the aspects of climate change and the emergence of climate change, we are all at risk. And this poses a series of challenges for us architects and urban designers that are common in many different places. And there are, certainly in our practice, we feel that there are 2 fundamental challenges that then relates to cities today. One that I'm not going to talk about is what to do with suburbia. On the sort of that end of the sprawls of cities that are obviously related to also the popularization of the car and so on, that then create one type of city. And in the opposite end of that is high density and over high density and tall buildings, and how we are living more compactly, and how you create with these difficult types then good places. And then, so started with this notion of the skyline, and then the tall buildings as a sort of a fabric, and then what is the sort of cities that then obviously that generates. And there was once upon a time that the skyline of Manhattan was something absolutely special and absolutely unique, because it was a kind of, imagine, arriving as a sort of perhaps a European immigrant in the 1920s to this emerging kind of a metropolis. Must have felt like arriving to Imperial Rome back in the time. That skyline is still special today. But perhaps it's starting to become less special, because you are also seeing in other places a sort of kind of a repetition of the same model, being that in Doha, being that in Dubai. We even have a little bit of that now in London, and then we have kind of walkie-talkies and scalpels and helter-skelters and so on, as we call them. And then we are generating this kind of interesting skyline and so on, and you also have your own here. And in a sense, what is the type of city that these accumulations of, in a sense, objects generate? And in a sense, we always love putting this slide that is kind of a sense of you have the eternal one, and you have the more pointy one, and you have the more the pinky one, and it's this kind of a collection of objects that is very, very difficult to believe that then this collection of autonomous elements can generate the sort of a fabric that we associate with great cities. So I'm going to go to 3 scales, and then that relates to the numbers, and in which way tall buildings in relation to how we have been practicing with tall buildings can generate what we believe are still good places and good kind of pieces of cities. And the first one is, number 1, when you are only one building. And then we have this conversation back in practice that in the moment that then you have a building that literally pokes above the parapet of the skyline of the rest of the city, what is the urban duty that this building should perform? This is not a tower, of course. This is Santa Maria Novella in Florence, where I spent half of my life is London, half of my life is in Florence. And a quarter is here, and another 10th is in Asia these days. And this was done by obviously, it's Alberti facade, and it's quite cool because you see over there, it says Giovanni Rucellai pay for this. So it's a kind of advertisement of the gentile Rucellai family. And what is interesting about this facade is that it's always facing the square. And there they put marble, they paid a good architect to do a fantastic urban facade because you are facing a square. But then, if you see it from the back, it's cheap brick. It's cheap kind of stone and so on. But it's this notion of buildings that have backs and fronts, that have a way of presenting themselves with public decorum, into a public square, and then other facades that are background, are part of the fabric of a city. This is, in fact, the facade that greets you as you come out of the station in Santa Maria Novella. And it's interesting because when your Americans kind of start in developing towers in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, they took those lessons into buildings that were tall, but were still very urban. So this is Sullivan in New York, in Manhattan, where the only building that hit there, in which there is a fantastic facade towards the street with an incredible cornice because you look up and that is part of the urban decorum. And this is another one close by. And then you see the side, and it's kind of a very straightforward, it's very utilitarian, and so on. And it's interesting, this is in Upper East Side. You have these 2 elevations that are kind of incredibly well composed, that are they're kind of still very kind of regular. You have cornices, you have daytones, and so on, that is addressing the street. And then you see the side, and there is a clear distinction between the elements that are addressing the main street and contributing to this urbanity of the main street, and then other facades that are slightly different, are kind of a more pared down. And this is just to illustrate that tall buildings can contribute to the legibility of the city, as long as then you address the sort of the hierarchy that buildings have to play in the sort of a wider composition of districts and part of a city. But then we come into this, and so on, that is, we can all agree that is a well-composed facade. It's a well-composed building by, obviously, Mies van der Rohe in New York. And some people say that it's a tripartite kind of a composition that have a base, a middle, and a top. This is slightly debatable. But then this incredibly elegant kind of a composition, then I don't know if Mies van der Rohe was simply saying that this facade is so good that I'm going to also turn it in the side, and the other side, And in the back, no matter what, no matter orientation, no matter that you have Fifth Avenue in the front and you have a back, that is a back. So, and then Lever House in Gordon Munshaft and so on, that's exactly the same. You simply wrap this object with the same facade that has no hierarchy. Backs and fronts and sides are exactly the same. And in this operation, in which then all elements start to become the same, the buildings become objects. The buildings become pavilions that are self-referential. They are incredibly well composed. You can incredibly elegant, but start to become more aloof to the city. So you turn around any of these buildings, and nothing happens. There's no back and forth and side. And I will argue that then that starts a tradition in which the tall buildings become objects, and the tall buildings become perfume bottles. And the perfume bottles, then, the role of the urbanity of how this building has to sit in the city start to become eroded. And the interest of a building start to become its form, its materiality, its height, its pinnacle, and so on. And like Zaha did in Miami or SOM building in Gothenburg, well, this building could be more or less interesting, but they are aloof, they are self-referential, and they are objectual. And it's very difficult to believe that then you can create a city that is mostly fabric with this type of building, because the purpose of this are kind of a self-referential and a little bit of a seeking for attention and so on. We are in a slightly different kind of a wavelength, and we are in a slightly different perhaps tradition in our practice that tries to combine the pressures of densification and height and so on that obviously we find today with a combination. Can these buildings be part of the fabric of a city? Can they be contextual? Can they be kind of a step back in relation to the objectual nature? And then what are the different strategies that then you can apply for that to work? These are not solutions. These are not perhaps partial answer to an anxiety in relation to that these buildings are part of cities today. Is there a way of dealing with them that then make them part of the fabric? This is a master plan that we have been doing for 15 years in London, in Canada Water. It's called, the area is called Canada Water because it's where the timber that came from Canada, or went to London from Canada, was stored and so on. And we have been working in this master plan for a long, long time. And we also were the architects of these two buildings here. That is phase one. This is an area that is incredibly central. You see there Tower Bridge, that's the Shire, that's the city of London over there. And then you have the river, and it's this area over here, and then we're talking about this building in particular there, this couple of buildings. So it's a part of London that's very central, but feels a little bit secluded, feels a little bit kind of detached from and has to do with transport and other series of conditions. And that's an image of the building and so on, and we like to call it a single tower. And we were, this was part of the master plan. There's a sort of a cluster of other tall buildings in the area as part of the master plan. And the typology of the building has a little bit of a podium and tower on top that then we started, when we started doing the actual building, we started to question. Was a hybrid building having office and workspace in the lower floors and a residential building on top. It's a context that is, as many contexts in London, is in between conditions, have a lot of Victorian and kind of utilitarian architecture from the 19th century, where this was a sort of a working dock, but at the same time has a sort of a presence in the skyline of the city because of its proximity to the river. And these were the docks when they were working docks. This is kind of the dock office, so that that then this building is one of the remaining Victorian facilities that are still there. And this is a fantastic map of the bomb damage after the Second World War. What is interesting, black, is that it was destroyed, and that's where that remained. What is interesting about that map, it was a combination of big things and very small things. These big things were the sheds, and then you see the graying here of houses and docks and kind of a more nimble buildings of the Victorian era over there. So our project tried to, in a sense, mediate between these scales of large things and small things, with a building that by its size and height was going to be a big thing on its own. And then it's a core preoccupation of us in the practice how, as buildings are becoming larger, you don't lose the small grain of things. You still have, at the very least, mid-grains. If a small grain might not be possible, how you then break down some of these buildings to then establish a sort of a thing in which mid-grain can happen. And what this kind of a breaking the mass into a smaller component allow us to have is a transition between this larger scale that happened here and this smaller scale. That's the historic dock office that I was pointing out before, in which we established a sort of literal transition with things that are addressing the larger scale and things that are addressing the smaller scale. Giorgio Morandi will do several appearances tonight because we really love his work, the Italian painter, that we really enjoy this still life. He chose one motif that was painting bottles, and spent 50 years painting bottles. And so he mastered it. We like this notion of family of objects and family of buildings and family of bottles that are painted in the same manner. And this was a sort of an inspiration that you'll see in other parts of the presentation, the lecture tonight. So how then the building that could be a singular thing becomes a bundle of things, becomes a tower made of 3 towers that allows also to break down the scale of the tower, but perhaps more important is this notion of orientation, that when you see it from different places, the tower looks different. And then this allows to have one of, for us, the fundamental role that a tall building can perform, that is the legibility of a place when you're farther away. So that you can locate and say, oh, okay, over there, 500 meters away, is where the tube station is. If I'm really looking one side of thing, I know if I'm looking north-south or east-west. Also, that allows, in a sense, the configuration of the internal, also a sort of a design of inside-out in relation to the tall building. So it became a sort of this kind of a group of buildings that have warehouses for workspace, brick warehouses for workspace in the lower floors. There were 3 brick warehouses, and then the tower interlock on the side that was also broken into 3. So we sometimes say it's 1 building, but it's 6.5 buildings. 3 warehouses, 3 towers, and this connected piece in the middle. What this generates is that when you see this from afar, sometimes you see 3 forms, sometimes you see 2 forms, and sometimes you see 2 forms from the other side. You see that then the lower bit of the warehouse starts to help with the transition to then the scale of this kind of a building, 19th century and early 20th century. So then this building has a back and a front. It has a response towards the dock office and another response towards the water and the dock. And then as you see it from afar, then again, sometimes you see 2 forms. Sometimes you see 1 form and so on, like here from the park. Sometimes you see 1 flank. Sometimes you start seeing the 3 forms, interlock, and so on. So it's, at least in our view, in our opinion, a tower that is responsive to how it sits in the city. And you can literally orientate yourself in relation to where you are seeing, if you are seeing from this dock office, or from docks, or from the water. But another thing that we were wondering when we were doing this one, another tower that I'll show you later, can a tower be contextual? Or can a tower be of its place? Or can all these buildings are always kind of a self-referential and so on? So this is a photograph of the doctors when they were still working. And when you walk around this area, you see a lot of these things. You see a lot of remnants of the steel kind of basculant bridges, cranes, brick buildings with this kind of interlocking of brick and metal and timber that was obviously one of the sources of inspiration for this interlocked tower and so on, and from the language that then we were exploring, sometimes in these models, so how the towers started to become kind of a reference to this architecture of the area, but obviously done today with kind of a unitized and modular construction that then allows to have this sort of a metal tower that feels industrial, feels kind of, has a relationship. And sometimes you can walk close to those red bridges, and then there is a connection between that path and then this tower of the 21st century. And you get this layering then of a brick warehouse, that then when you are closer to the ground, and then this metal tower, that then is a sort of an interlock of forms, generated with panels, sometimes more vertical, sometimes more gridded, that then generates a place that, well, from this side you see the 3 towers, from the other side you see only 2. You have a connection with this new red bridge, and there is a basculant bridge just behind us that generates a sort of tower that, in our view, feel of its place. And that's a strategy that we're also trying to apply in a project that we are doing right now here in Toronto, in Quayside. It's a competition that we won not too long ago, and we have the lowest tower in this ensemble, but it's fine. And it's interesting because it's sort of a central location. And obviously, when you are doing a tower in Toronto, the most obvious reference is a quarry in Italy. So just check the size of the structure, just to grasp the scale of this quarry in Matera. And we were interested, because it's perhaps one thing that also runs through some of our work, this notion of step forms. And the step forms would happen when you have horizontal ledges, that then greenery start happening there. And that was one of the formal strategies, how you make these big things broken into smaller things. You start introducing human scale in large buildings. That is also something that in this piece from Gonzalo Fonseca, Uruguayan sculptor that we really like, that has, again, one large piece within which you start recognizing a small thing, a face, some funny foot here, stair, an egg, floating egg there, and it's this balance between kind of how you counterbalance the larger scale of things with the smaller things that then are literally the scale of your body as a human being. So these were some of the sketches that we did in the early stages of the project, in which, as the building comes to the ground, it's almost sculpted and carved, and you have this step form that then generates a series of terraces where greenery can basically happen. And that greenery relates to, in the overall master plan, SLA, the landscape architects have kind of proposed this urban forest and how that can literally go up the building. Above that, the building starts to become a little bit purer, but then is punctuated by this series of small elements, this series of almost little jewels that are, in a sense, kind of these small pergolas, pavilions, entrances, porticos, that in a sense, once again, bring kind of a smaller scale into a sort of a large building. And the important thing for us in relation to each of these things is that they have an urban role. Some of them are entrances, literally addressing the street. Some of them are pergolas and that relates to, and pavilions that relates to amenity, places where we gather, or this one that we call kind of the lake room, that then is a sort of amenity space at the top of a building. So these devices do 2 things. On the one hand, introduce a small scale in a big thing, like some of those cornices that we were seeing in the Louis Sullivan buildings, that in a cornice have that role and so on. But the other thing, again, is to give orientation. So when you are seeing this building from the lake, there's going to be this room at the top. If you are seeing from the city, from the downtown, you will not see that. So it's a building that has, again, a back and a front, a back and a side. So give orientation to the whole building. I don't know when I took this photograph, probably it was like 15 years ago when Florence was not so packed with tourists. And it's one of the few occasions when this Loggia de Lanzi was kind of empty or half empty. But it's this moment of civicness of loggias and that the Medicis were doing, not unlike the Rucellais, trying to, in a sense, impress their citizens in relation to, well, kind of a beautification of their city. And it's obviously a really kind of a grand gesture, but also these devices can be very humble. Can be like a rooftop pavilion in the Palazzo Gondi, or the Loggia del Pesce in Venice, a way of framing when you are inside out the canals, or ones that are completely integrated with buildings. So they have different degrees of civicness, if you like, that then we apply as a sort of a family of devices, family of elements, that some of them are really big, or rather big, that then relates to an entrance for a community center. Others are more modest, that is an entrance to the residential part, and then all this series of other elements that happen in other parts of the building. So these devices have an urban role, so I'm saying kind of some of them are entrances, some of them are terraces, or at the top of a building generate this kind of a overscale, perhaps, rooftop loggia, because, I mean, in a sense, it's at the scale of being there, but it's at the scale of the mega urban room that is the Lake Ontario, and so on. So then, if you are close to the ground, the building is kind of a curve, and it's kind of it's softer, and you have all this greenery going up, and the form is perhaps less clear because it's curved, it's Matera-like, it's quarry-like. As you move around, some of these devices that are addressing the street start to become clearer, so you have a sort of a clear direction of where you enter and where kind of the civicness of these elements. And then, as you start seeing from far, then the buildings start to become more calmer and rigorous and elegant in our view, hopefully timeless present with that oversized rooftop loggia that probably would be a sort of, in a few years' time, a really nice place to look towards the lake. Right, then what happens when you have more than one building? That you have the opportunity to have 3 buildings, 4 buildings, 5 buildings. And then you have the pleasure of playing with the space in between buildings. Like in this sculpture of Giacometti, with these 5 figures, their individual figures are really interesting, but it's the tension, proximity, or distance between the figures that generates, obviously, the overall composition. And, or Morandi again, in his etching it was really interesting because it was emphasizing not the bottles, but the space in between the bottles. That then, when we are designing groups of buildings, then you start having the possibility of then start looking how 3 buildings come together. In this sketch for the Christie Cookie master plan that we did some years ago here, in which then these 3 buildings are a family, but the role of their building is what happened in between. And if you go to the Dominion Center, and you have these then buildings and look up, and that funny-looking golden one that I think is actually quite cool, you have then this group of things that they're looking up. That in the case of our Christie Cookie, then you have these 3 buildings, and then also 2 or 3 buildings in the context that then frame the space as you are looking up, but perhaps more importantly, frames the space where you're looking down. They become landmarks. Not landmarks in the sense of the perfume bottles, marking the land where we meet. Because then these buildings are literally shaping public space. The important thing here, in our view, is not the 3 buildings, the 3 towers. They are going to be cool, and they're going to be beautiful and elegant. And the most important thing is that when you are from afar, you see this group of 3 buildings, and you know that there's a square there, and so on, that then marks a point of a public space, and so on. So this strategy we have applied in several projects. This is one in London. It's called Key Bridge. This was, I think it still is, highest density residential development in London. So super high density, has really tall buildings for London. They are kind of funny for Toronto. They are only 36 stories. That's a mid-rise building here, and so on. But it's tall, or tallish, as we like to call them. And this is a very interesting hinge location in London. There is all this new development that over there. Now, there, that's the American Embassy. And this is all sort of a 9Ls, is what it's called an opportunity area. That was one of the zones in London where there was a sort of basically a densification program. There was an extension of a tube line, and there were several opportunity areas kind of defined in the London plan. And we won a competition to do this project over here. Depending on who you ask, it was in the wrong side of the tracks, or in the right side of the tracks. We think it's the right side of the tracks. Because then here is what is called a conservation area. So that is kind of a sort of a terrace houses and kind of a park. So how this building literally hinge and transitions between this new London and this old London, and so on. So the project have a role, kind of a role of how to mediate between these conditions. And if you walk around, there are these things we call mansion blocks that are kind of a mid-rise buildings, of which there are 2 or 3 remaining in the area. There are some kind of a terrace house scale. This is a pub. This is a building that exists in the side. It's a brutalist building. That was very interesting. We tried to keep it, but it was impossible to do so for many different reasons I can expand later. And then we have a regeneration of bad towers and worse towers and kind of a mid-type tower, and this is a cool tower. And so on, some really bad tall buildings and some good, kind of a good or goodish tall buildings coming. But this is to illustrate this sort of disparate scales and times and typologies that you find over here. That is part of this transformation of London, that then you have that we all know, and then you have that London emerging. And what is the role of then when you are dealing with this scale in the transformation of a skyline of a city like London? And in a sense, what we said is like, well, this project could be what we call a typological ensemble. And how, depending on where you are seeing, it responds differently. And then you have a little bit of that, of the scale of 3 stories and 4 stories. You have a little bit of that is a scale of a mid-rise buildings with these mansion blocks with the interesting kind of a white things on top. And then you have a little bit of that, of tall buildings. So you have this series of different typologies coming together. So you create these buildings that exist in the on-site. So you have all these different typologies coming together. You have a notion of transition, but also importantly, in a high-density development, you have choice. You might live here, you might live here, or you might live here. You have all these different typologies of buildings, but also typologies of homes that can happen there. So we studied all these buildings separately. So there are buildings that are kind of small, buildings that are that mid-scale, and then buildings that are that large scale, all coming together in a very high-density development, but in which then a third of the site was public open space that makes that the whole thing work incredibly well in planning terms. So then this generated the possibilities of basically shaping the spaces, using the buildings to do so. So this was a sort of a Victorian church that was neglected, around which we did a new square. That square was faced by one of these mansion blocks, and this is a 36-story building. But look, when that 36-story building lands and comes close to this building, on the street, this is only 4 stories. So when you are there, then you see a building that then is literally stepping down to meet the scale of the Victorian church. And then you have then other datums that are 9-story that relate to the scale of that mansion block building. And then after that, off you go. And then you crop the view, and then there are another 25 stories above that. But what is interesting, and some of you have been there, is that for most people, most normal people, like, in other words, not architects, normal people work like this, no? So they don't tend to work like this because you might hit yourself if you do so. So, and then when you do that, basically, as long as the space is properly shaped, the buildings are just part of the fabric. And that's, in a sense, what we feel that happens there. So similar here, the buildings are disposed to, in a sense, generate this large space above which then there's a 24-story tower over here. But this whole thing, the role is actually to frame this little building over there. So the Victorian church, and then this other building that was a listed Georgian terrace house. So the role of this large, high-density complex was actually to incorporate some of the pieces of the history of the site into a wider composition that is legible, that is kind of well, literally a piece of city. The tower are very, very specific, and this is the thing of, can a tower be contextual? This is a tower that have a front and a back, or that have, at the very least, two faces, like a Janus, the Roman god of gateways and contradiction. So it is highly articulated to one side, but it's very different to the other side. So when you see it from one side, towards the towers that I show you in the opportunity area, it looks like this. It's a whoosh, no step backs. No, it's just like one go, and so on. It looks like a tower. But then, as you move around, this also become a little bit more relaxed and start having all these series of steps and so on. When you're seeing this tower from the conservation area, it's articulated and have all these cuts and have all these terraces. So it is a sort of, again, a building that is not a pavilion, that is aloof from what is happening around, but it's trying to be responsive. And then it's interesting in the ground floor, well, the towers are over here. They are shaping that space that I was telling you about. That's the church. This is the terrace house that I mentioned. Creates this meandering space that is highly specific. We wouldn't do this in another place. This just belongs to this peculiar site with this peculiar condition. And then as you move up, then you start seeing then the towers appears as towers with these gaps in between. And then at the very top, you have them like that. And then this is where the mansion block drops. But that generates that you look up, and then you have this very peculiar dual condition. You see from this side, and it looks like this. It's tower, then have some interesting things in the facade that I probably will talk another time. Or you see from this side and have this series of terraces and so on that create a sort of at least dual conditions depending on where we're seeing. But the thing that we really, really like about this is, again, the spaces in between and how the group of buildings generate these peculiar silhouettes and these peculiar spaces that we spend a lot of time just sculpting the air. They're sculpting, well, obviously using the mass for creating a sort of interesting space between the buildings when you are looking down or when you're looking up. So when you see it from one side, then you see this group of buildings. And so when you are there, the space expands and compresses and have water and have greenery. Believe me, there's green there, not in this winter day. That tries to then pose the kind of the idea that you can do tall buildings of that scale that feels that they are relative. They have a lineage and connection with this mansion block, with this richly textured architecture of the end of the 19th century, creating a sort of high-density development that, in a sense, is trying to be more in dialogue with this old London, but also recognizing the scale of this new London that is emerging these days. We have also tried to do that here in this kind of a group of buildings that then shape a space. This is the first project that we did in Toronto. It's a competition that we won in Cumberland Square, Yorkville, or whatever it's called, because it's a very complex site in which we were very excited, and we were invited, and we won the competition, worked on this for a while, but then land issues, and it's complex, very complex project. And we started with this kind of these 5, I think it was 65 stories or something like that, 70 stories, that was a family of buildings. Some of them have, they have funny heads and so on that share kind of haircuts. Some of them kind of are looking a little bit like that or turning around. They are figural. But the important thing there is that they're a family and so on, because we were not interested in them as individuals. We were interested in them as a group. But then they create a group, a little bit Rockefeller Center-like, not in the sense of a Rockefeller Center. It's interesting because it's a piece of city in which all the buildings are very similar. Well, some are taller, some are lower, but they share a DNA. That was what we were interested in here. But the most important thing of these 5 buildings was that they shape a space in between, in which there was what we were imagining could be a sort of a covered square, in which there are the footprint of 5 tall buildings, but when you are there, really that's not there. What matters is the space, again, the space in between. So you have 5 buildings in which, one of the things that we have tried to do this in several times, so you are shaping that space. That is a space that you go to and a space that you go through, because it was a sort of also a route through, in which we were interested in how then the facades that were facing the square belong to the square, not to the buildings, and so on. And a la Santa Maria novella, we were saying that we should have marble, white marble, in that facade. So those 5 facades for those 5 elevations share something. Of course, we know value engineering, so it was never going to be marble, but it was going to be white. And it's white because it catches light in a different way than the other side. So that facade was the primary facade, and so on. And then the other ones were secondary ones. And it's this notion of then, again, the 5 buildings together shape a space, create a space that, we felt that there was going to be a very interesting group of golden hair, so kind of was brass, metal, kind of a lanterns at the top. But the most important thing was this, that sort of a covered square that you could go through, and then on top of that, there were 70-story towers that were, funnily enough, secondary to this covered square. But then we got to the last challenge, that is when you have 15 towers, when you have 20 towers, when you have 25 towers, when you are designing a piece of city, not even a sort of a block with 5 towers, you are a whole district, how you deal with this thing of putting a lot of towers together that is challenging and is exhilarating and scary at the same time. In cities like this, that I have heard that you have certain pressures about homes, building some homes for Torontonians. We have the same issue in London. That is, it's a fantastic problem to have because it's a problem of successful cities where people want to be, but it's a problem nevertheless. And then how we always provide homes. And this is a speculation of how Florence would have looked in the 15th century, 16th century, with a lot of towers there, because this competition of who has the tallest tower has been eternal. So not something about the 20th century, 21st century. This is speculation of all the medieval towers that used to be there. There are like 8 left. In San Gimignano, you still see some, and it was merchant competing, a wealthy family competing one against another for presence and kind of a prestige and so on. In London, there were obviously all the spires of churches and so on that also create a sort of a skyline of tallish buildings in relation to obviously what was the nominal fabric of a city. And in a sense, the cities that certainly we like the most are the cities where you have a lot of fabric, in which buildings, like in London, Paris, or Bologna, these are typological variations of the same thing. All these buildings are the same. It's the same family, it's the same type. Can you have a city with tall buildings in which tall buildings behave like this? We believe that is possible. This is Michigan Avenue in Chicago. These are tallish buildings, and this creates a fantastic street in which then obviously you have the sort of individual pieces, but then all together create something that is better than the individual pieces, that is a sort of cohesive whole, and so on. So this is one that some of you might know. This is a second project that we did here in Toronto. It's the 2150 Lecture Boulevard Master Plan, also known as Christie Cookie, because it was where the Christie Cookie factory used to be. A large endeavor, and we won sort of an international competition. And when you go there, and this is our client taking us around to this welcoming and kind of really cozy place, designed obviously with people in mind, and so on. Really, transport engineers went to town here. So it is kind of a difficult place just to navigate, but what was fascinating for us is you've walked 3 minutes and you are here. And this combination of high density and nature, a creek and water, and so on, for us was really fascinating. We don't have this in London in the same way. And this notion of how you can combine this literally being high rise and then you are in close proximity to a ravine and so on is truly fascinating. Such then, this is a sketch that we did in the first week of the competition that still remains the sort of the bones of the project. That was a sketch of the spaces. 3 squares informally related to one another, so that then when you go to one, you literally meander and so on. And that's the base of the project still today, in which there was one large park, 2 squares, some lanes, some groves, some largos. There is a midpoint between a street and a piazza. And the most important thing for us in relation to the structure of a master plan was this drawing, in which this is super mega high density, and really, really high density. But 42% of the site was open space. So you have this counterbalance of a lot of buildings and a lot of open space. That then, because we split it, we didn't want to make one super mega large park. We wanted some lessons from King's Cross and other projects that we have done in London, that you split it into different pieces, so you have choice. So some spaces are intimate and tiny, some are mid-size, some are really large. Some are green, some are hard landscape, and so on. I don't do nature, I don't like green stuff. I understand that it's very important intellectually, and my landscape friends always tease me about that. My wife loves green stuff, so you learn in life that having diversity of choice is very important for cities and marriages. So this structure of open space then is the backbone of the whole master plan, within which then the buildings are, again, secondary. And the buildings are all very simple. We like rectangular buildings. They are easy to build. They're flexible. They are resilient. They can change and so on. But they are informally placed to one another. And this is something we call urban picturesque. This is a snail by Matisse towards the end of his life, when he couldn't paint anymore. He was just making this cutout in which the figures are relatively pure, but the relationship to one another is informal. And then you create interesting spaces in between. That is, in a sense, what we have tried to literally compose. So, for example, and we did here, like, I don't know, 350 views or whatever, but because they were journeys, they were little walks through the site. So we did stuff like this. You arrive in that point over there, and then you have one building on the side and another building on the other side, and the building flex. When the buildings open up, then you see a building in the back. The building in the back is not tall, but is frontally to you. When you walk towards that, the street does that to you, so it pushes you to one side, and so on, and then you see another building, another couple of buildings over there, and you see them obliquely. So you start seeing that they are there, but they're carrying forward. As then you carry on walking, then that building starts to become a flank, and then you see over there, then the flank of this building, this tower, that we have pushed out, I think it was 8 meters, so you see part of it, but not entirely. And that thing over there, when you get there, literally drove you to the station, the new train station square. Everything in this project was done like that. So the buildings are informally pleasant to one another, but everything was a journey in which what we were composing was not how the plan looked, is how you experience moving through cities, because what really matters is the journey and this notion of a picturesque experience as you move through. But also how we call it is shaped by the environment. And it's very, maybe we should take credit for that. It's a kind of a interesting coincidence, let's say, that this informality in plan works really well in environmental terms. Red is bad, blue is good. This is the cold wind that comes from the lake, that when it's your lovely minus 25 in winter, that you're in January or February, you all know what does it feel in this wind that, because you have a gridded city, accelerates. And then when you have this informality and so on, then you have obstacles. The wind slows down, so you have better conditions where matter in the ground floor. So you have more usability of the public realm as you basically get into the colder month. What this generates is that these 15 towers that were in this way were all kind of very specific to their site. They were all family, but they were all shaped and cut and carved and so on to create this notion of, rather than a tower and a podium, a sort of a step form that helps with the wind and so on, but also helps with daylight in relation to where it matters in sort of the public space, creating, again, you see that we repeat this again and again at different scales, sort of a families of buildings in which you have then all these possibilities, kind of a mid-rise buildings, kind of low buildings, then what we call low towers, mid towers, or very tall towers, and so on. So what you have here is then diversity of typologies that, again, we studied separately. You have small things like that or large things like that, and then a series of blocks that were all very different, sometimes a single one, sometimes 2 buildings, sometimes 3 buildings, and so on, that create a sort of a piece of city within which buildings shape a space, square, shape another space, a station square. These 4 buildings were kind of a shape in that, or a larger group that shape the park, in which even buildings across the street were part of. And then some buildings at the corner that become kind of a gateways and lanterns and so on, that then generate this notion of buildings that respond to the different scales in which you perceive this thing. These are kind of projects generating this notion of what we call composed informality. These are very Morandi-like, in which obviously buildings are tall and mid-rise and so on, all coming together. In these spaces, this is 18 meters, goes down to 6 and open up to 20 again. Then, yeah, there are buildings there that are 65 stories. There are buildings that are 7. There are buildings that are 40. In our view, it doesn't matter. I mean, the height, what matters is the space in between, and obviously how you move from spaces that are informal, larger squares that are more formal, streets that are now defined by a new edge, and so on, all triggered by public transport. Otherwise, these densities are really not possible. Spaces that are covered, so in your minus 20, at least here will be minus 5, and then you can use this throughout winter, but then leaves to alleys and so on that then coincide, kind of to have the juxtaposition of a small scale and large scale, and parks that then are, as I was saying, for the development, but also for neighbors that are outside the site, creating this notion of informality that perhaps would feel as it was organically growing, and perhaps would feel as it has always been there. We have done, there are only 2 more. This is even larger scales, a couple of master plan, one in London and one in Toronto. This is all oak. It's an enormous part of West London. That is one of the industrial engines of a city. And in here, what is interesting, it is then the role of tall buildings and the generation of homes. So in mid-19th century, it was farmland. Then it started to be industrialized, and you see the arrival of trains and depots and so on. And right now, it's like this. So this is a Park Royal, that is one of sort of a more important industrial areas of London. A new train station for HS2. So all the side that is in public hands needs to be kind of densified and regenerated and so on. Again, a place of a lot of contradiction. You have really bucolic areas like that. You have industrial areas like that. You have this new London of tall buildings emerging. And then you have this between canals and then natural reserve alongside the train lines and so on. Rather large, so 20 hectares, almost 8,000 homes, 20,000 people. So it's a large endeavor with the public money, led by basically the city. And I'm not going to explain the whole of a master plan. This will be too long. So it is a very piecemeal and very complex site. So there are 6 principles there, but it's effectively 2 neighborhoods. This is what we call Old Town Center and the Canal Side neighborhood. Suffice to say, like then we have these spines that connect across. What should be then the role of tall buildings that happen opportunistically in sites that then you can have then, and what is then the legibility that you give to this wider composition that is by nature heterogeneous. And this was a very pivotal slide in the whole of the development of a project. That was when we were telling to the skepticism in part of a client around tall building, say, look, you guys have here 120 buildings, of which 110 are resi, of which only 26 are tall. Tall defined in the GLA, Greater London Authority, as above 20 stories. But crucially, I mean, those are 20% of a building, but it's 55% of the homes. And the public money and the public side has the duty to generate homes for Londoners. So, and then the discussion of tall buildings relaxed, because it was not so much about having them, it's how many of them, and where, and why, and where is the role, and so on. So Morandi again, and this thing of how he concentrates some tall bottles here, tall bottles there, and then there are valleys in the middle, and the compositions of then kind of these different figures and so on. And this is a sort of the whole of the master plan. And again, I'm not going to walk you through all of it. But what was interesting is that those 26 buildings, we told the client, really, what you should care about is only 8 of them. And those 8 buildings, then you should be incredibly prescriptive in relation to design codes and the role that they should perform. On the other 20 whatever, you can be relaxed about it. Why these 8? Because they have a role in how you read these as a piece of city. You have 3 towers that are rival towers. When you arrive from Holston, when you arrive from North Acton, when you arrive from the HS2, there's something that receives you, and something that addresses you, that you are literally arriving to this new piece of city. Then there are, although the client didn't like the word, these landmarks. And we call them landmarks because we're towers associated with the 3 large parks. So when you see these towers, you know that there's a park there. And so on, so they have another kind of legibility. And what we did, diagrammatically speaking, we tried to link them together. And then we wanted to have 2 Flatiron buildings somewhere, because Flatiron is very cool. And then when these 2 neighborhoods that for some reason ended up in 2 triangles, in this point, then to have 2 buildings that were a couple, and we're literally talking to each other and marking the point of the conjunction between the 2 buildings. And what we did, in a sense, to convince all that sounds more or less convincing as a theory, but what really matters if it is when you walk, if you read them, or not, and so on. So we did literally several of these, again, walks in which then in this point you see one landmark and the other, and then that towers start to give you a sense of size, a sense of distance between one end of the side and the other. And then as you start walking through, obviously that one disappears. You walk and then reappears again. And then you carry on working, and then you start seeing the ones that are the landmarks, the ones that are related to the park, and so on. From the other side, you have similar things. You have, and then when seeing one of them, and then one of the landmarks related to the park. Then when these two flat iron towers are talking to each other, and then you see some of this. So basically, you have this as you walk through, and imagine that you live there. These buildings start to become part of your daily journey, and then allow you to situate, meet me by the landmark over there, that tower over there with the funny hat, and so on. And they become points of legibility of the whole of a city, allowing you then as you are walking through, you start recognizing these elements happening around. Final one, this one in occupant-miniscent. Now we are working here in Toronto, part of an amazing team with the SLA, GHG, traffic, momentum, and so on, and obviously Waterfront Toronto, that are working in the shoulders and an immense amount of work with some of the most kind of a mind-blowing city-making efforts that we have seen anywhere in the world. Because it takes kind of effort to reroute a river, and so on, and generates a sort of the amazing kind of a park that obviously come here, an endeavor that have been going for a while, and create the opportunity to, well, this incredible park that I'm sure that you all have visited, that is really, really fascinating as a piece of infrastructure, but as a piece of public realm and obviously landscape. And working with this later, well, how you combine this notion of density, high density, reconsideration of what is a street in this particular part of Toronto, and then there were a lot of work in relation to, well, the legacy that is in there, in the industrial artifacts and so on, and the landscape, the character of a different street, the space for nature, and they started with nature, they started with the spaces, and then the buildings came later. We literally came later in the design of a process to start understanding, and this notion of how then buildings contribute to then the definition of the spaces in between. And there were, obviously, as in that project in London, what is the role of in the different buildings to define the different edges of the site? What is the edge towards the park, in which you have mid-rise and high and tall mid-rise, defining a sort of a gentle edge towards the park? How then there's opportunity to then generate some sort of Keating Channel, an urban room, in which you have the two sides of a canal kind of defined by buildings, a central street in which you have, again, low buildings and mid-rise buildings, like in that project in Kiveridge. There is a side in the middle that has another private owner. How do you incorporate that side into sort of a wider composition? And then towers that then had to do, again, with the points of arrival. And those towers could be more special because they are literally the elements through which basically you are arriving and give legibility and access to the whole thing. So this is the sort of overall composition. And again, what matters to us is how you got to this, the figure ground of the spaces, in which then you have basically a series of a sequence of spaces. Some are larger, some are threshold, some direct you in the other direction. Then you have compression and expansion. Even though this is still gridded, within a grid, you can still do that, and so on, so that then you have a sort of a sense of a hierarchy in the journeys that then gives way to then the series of open blocks in which some of these buildings are tall, some of these buildings are mid-rise, some of these are low, and then you have a lot of space and air in between. And I'm not going to go into all the distances in between buildings, but suffice to say that you can see it's very porous, particularly that they have all these different views. Similar strategy of then having all these different kind of a combination of buildings coming together in kind of a hybrid blocks in which you have all typologies within each block that gives you diversity of blocks. That is what cities, good cities are. and hierarchy in relation to all the different frontages that these urban blocks will kind of face. So that will generate, in our view, an experience that will be quite interesting when you are facing the park. This kind of a curve, kind of a frontage that go up and down and is gentle, and the greenery goes in between. A side that feels dock-like, that is kind of a part of the sort of a almost, well, this kitchen channel, no more industrial, that is part of the heritage of this area, that then as you move inside, have then this smaller scale. You have to find houses in this kind of a district that could be quite surprising in our view, incorporating things like the silos and then creating sort of a new square next to that, that will generate a space that would be high density, but in our view would be really varied, have diversity of building, diversity of choice, and so on, and hopefully will contribute to the skyline of this amazing city of yours. Last few slides. So why this matters, no? This matters because this is a city in transformation, no? And Mark Twain used to say this, no? Buy land, because they are not making anymore. And land is the most precious resource that what we have, and how to use it responsibly, and so on. So why tall buildings? Because building compactly, building closer, allows to have these other things that are important apart from having your home. Having schools, having shops, having things to do, having a train station, and having all the things that make city really work and tick. So we did this small comparison, and by the way, one of the most onerous things in sustainability and carbon terms is not the concrete of a building, it's the roads. And this is where you put the pipes, and where you put the energy, and where you put water that has to travel kilometers to serve houses. So the more compact that you make cities, the more sustainable they will become. So we did this little exercise because a lot of people say, no, we need to do mid-rise cities and so on, which mid-rise cities are nice and so on, but in some places that's not the right answer. In some places, actually, the right answer is to be more dense and pack more things that allow different aspects in relation to obviously the uses. So this is the site of Christie Cookie. It's 11 hectares, within which, because it's very compact, only 6.3% of the site is roads. So it's very, very low, and so on. And then here you can pack 7,500 homes. 7,500 homes make having a new train station viable. When you have a new train station viable, you can be in 12 minutes in Union Station, and so on. Not only for the people that live here, but all the neighbors that live around this thing, that they make the whole district immediately connected to the center of a city. But if you want to do this with a 10-story building, mid-rise buildings, you will need a little bit more of land. You will need 27 hectares. And it's difficult to find that amount of land in one go, in one place, close to where you want, close to where services happen, and so on. Or interestingly, to serve that in sizes, in block sizes that have 4 or 5 buildings, 30% of the site will be roads, against 6% in the more compact. So this will have the carbon terms in relation to the buildings might have less concrete, but there's a lot of roads on this. And then that's to provide the same 7,500 homes. And if you want to have houses, suburbia, and so on, you will need only 420 hectares. And then of that, almost 90 hectares will be roads. Interestingly, the percentage will be slightly lower, but it's an enormous amount of tarmac, of pipes, of water, and all this have dissipation and so on. So to produce the same 7,500 homes. And a nice comparison between the 3 of them. Why this matters to us? Because we believe in density. We intellectually and wholeheartedly believe that density is the answer to live in better cities, to have better places, to have better homes, to have better lives. And virtuous density, it is, we believe that better places support more density. And more density brings more people. And more people make better places. And so on. That is the notion of virtuous density, the places that we cherish, places where we meet each other, and it's something that we believe so much that we will put it in our own bags. Density is good, and that's that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I bet you need a breather.
Yes.
Well, gosh, that was a pretty rich lecture in terms of things to think about and talk about. So I'm going to try to choose a few highlights. Well, I couldn't decide whether to begin with your beginning or with your end, but one of the things that strikes me is that you talk a lot about, I guess, the structure of experience at the ground plane, the pedestrian experience. So you have your tower picturesque, which sort of seems like your effort to. It's like to bring Camillo Sitte's picturesque Italian city into the world of towers. And then you talked about the way in which. Like the shape of the tower sometimes is able to signal in the long view the pattern of the city. You look at the tower and you sort of understand its location somehow through its expressed geometry, which all seems very interesting to me. But it's interesting because you started with those images of Manhattan. And what's so characteristic of Manhattan is that the towers start out anchored to the fabric, and then they go through their telescoping transformation, and they turn into connected. I mean, they go through, they mutate on their way up. They become spires, and whether it's Woolworth, Chrysler, Empire State Building to name the most famous ones, but there are dozens and dozens. But your projects seem to insist upon the continuity between what you were trying to, the ground plane and the high rise. And I will tell you, I'm just going to put that into a certain kind of context because you showed the perfume bottles. Then I've been thinking a lot about how contemporary cities are all shaped by this battle for distinction. That there is, and I think that the perfume bottles is a great, you love the Morandi, which is, a virtuous interplay of figure and void. The perfume bottles, I presume, is a kind of a vice. It's a battle of commodities whose bottle shapes are, simply, to make maybe empty distinctions. But it does seem like, the funny thing is that, today, you think about, like, we have a tower going up by Jeannie Gang, very, it's kind of like, I don't know how to name it, but it's like a tubular artichoke or something. Yeah. And it's characteristic of a lot of contemporary tower making, where the effort is to provide a kind of almost absolute distinction. And your project is all about continuity. But the one thing that I just am wondering about is that, what makes for the fabric of the ground and the facades of the ground is, maybe let me put it another way. Where is the role, how do you accommodate, or do you care, or do you simply reject this, I think, characteristic impulse toward distinction in the skyline? Do you think that that's wrong, and how does it relate to your appreciation for the New York skyline?
Well, to start with, if you don't know or read Camillo Sitte, you cannot work in Allies and Morrison. So yeah, Camilo City.
really?
Camilo City is a must. Yeah, we all have to.
I'd be happy to make it a requirement here.
Camilo City is amazing. I mean, and in a sense, our practice has a very peculiar kind of a hybrid tradition of, you could say that Italian rationalism of the school of thought of typological kind of all Kiberich and all these projects that you have, the small thing, its own right thing, and high-rise thing, the role of the typologies in city making, and obviously Townscape and Gordon Cullen and kind of a Camilo City in the long lineage of European cities at the heart of what we do, whilst at the same time combining that with the tradition of the English picturesque. That is effectively a landscape tradition with Capability Brown and so on, that we have translated that or transported that as Cullen did and the Architectural Review did in the 50s into the realm of building and urban design. So that is an experiential kind of moving through the city combined with a clear distinction of typology. So like that you mentioned city, because I was going to include it and I forgot to put in the 300 slides that we had. And paired with that is a figure that nowadays is less popular, that is Leon Krier. And Krier had that beautiful diagram that we sometimes use in our presentation, that is, he makes a distinction between res publica, res civitas, res economica, and res publica. The res civitas are the town halls, the churches, the theaters, the distinct monuments of a city that are, by nature, icons. So they have a reason to be different from the rest of them, what he called the res economica, that are the buildings where we live and the buildings that we work. And the combination of these two things give legibility to the two things. However, as buildings become products and they become assets and commodities, obviously the value that they are distinct and iconic and shape and so becomes a sort of a driving force for architecture and driving force for real estate and so on. We are healthily skeptical about that in relation to city making. It has a role in cities, so I do like Frank Gehry. I appreciate his work, and he has moments in which you want a bit of that. But that kind of a flippant slide of the perfume bottles is that when everything is iconic, nothing is iconic. Because everything is equivalent, and everything is trying to shout for attention, and we find that kind of makes bad cities.
The homogeneous heterogeneity. Homogeneous heterogeneity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, all those, you say the Manhattan Towers are, they're towers of commerce, not so many residential, but they are the res economicus, or however you put it. But I mean, it is interesting because in a sense, you're taking the streetscape and extruding it. The facades are extruded up to become the tower facades, it seems to me. And yet they are also often, particularly in the most cité-esque plan that you showed, the picturesque one, they're also the focus, I don't like saying the word foci, foci of all your picturesque attention. And the picturesque attention in a cité, in cités, beloved Italian cities, are usually works of, incredibly unique and brilliant architecture. They're palaces, churches, town halls. But here, the foci are simply the ordinary fabric buildings that sometimes are quite tall, but they're not, well, you see my point.
Yeah, it is that, well, in a sense, those are the ingredients that we play with today. So
say that again?
Those are the ingredients that we play with today.
Right.
It is, I mean, we build less palazzi, these
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
We have less kind of a Medicis and so on. So in a sense, the role is because these buildings will have a size, we have a presence, we have a scale in the city, in which way you deploy them, and in which way, in a sense, we want them to be, we want them to be fabric. We want it to be just like quietly there, not calling for too much attention. However, if you stop and pay attention, they should be incredibly well crafted and well composed.
Yes.
And the role of them, more than calling attention, is to frame what we feel is the most important thing, the spaces where we meet, the spaces where we gather. There are, the squares, the parks, the largos, and so on. And they are just quietly there.
So it's the paradox. You're an iconoclast. You're like a virtuous, I'm going to adventure something here, virtuous Protestant enjoying the drama, theatrical drama of Catholic cities.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's a very interesting answer because it's like you are resisting the, I guess, this play of idols, which is all these dramatic commodity forms that many of our towers have for no particular reason, but you're trying to recapture some of the richness and intricacy of experience that comes from cities that were once constituted by buildings of more distinct character.
We feel, and every now and then you see some of these more iconic buildings and you are, wow, this is cool. I do like a lot the Getty Tower in New York. I think it's a fantastic building. It's really beautiful and poetic and so on. I wouldn't like to have a city that is made of tons of those because then we become less special. But one of the fundamental problems with those kind of buildings is they are one-liners. And once you have seen it once or twice, then start to go, okay, then what? And then they lose their currency because then comes the next icon done by someone else and the next icon by someone else and so on, and they could become all equivalent. And that's a race that gets you nowhere. We feel that we are in a different kind of a path, one that we feel is a little bit harder, and you could claim that it's actually, I don't know, if what is more ambitious, if creating an icon or creating things that are timeless and are done for eternity.
I'm sorry, I feel like being a little selfish tonight and asking you one more question before giving the audience a chance.
Sure.
I keep thinking about those other examples like Piazza San Agnese in Rome, which takes some very irregular situations and turns them into an appearance of regularity. Yeah. Maybe likewise Santa Maria della Pace. I have a feeling you know all these places.
Yeah.
All these examples where the idiosyncrasies, the happenstance of urban form in cities like Rome, but even the irregularities of territories you were showing tonight, are places where architects have worked hard to extract or exact from them regularities. And they didn't do it necessarily through, let's say, ornamental facades, but through things that created the appearance of regular figuration, regular form, purposeful form. But I think that you are more drawn to there's a kind of a pleasure in either the drawing upon or the creation of what seems to be happenstance. Is that fair?
Kind of. So yeah, we have that.
Tell me I'm wrong.
Working with, because this is the product of many hands and conversations in the practice with colleagues and other kind of people in the office, and we swing between the two things and so on. So remember a few years ago, we were doing this small project in Oman. The site was 7 kilometers by 5 kilometers. So it was a small city and so on. And it was a fantastic exercise in urban design. when you are working at the scale, is that the great thing is you can have both. So we did this space that was Ramblas-like, and it was a room that was 500 meters long, with buildings that kept a sort of a continuous cornice that create almost like an incredibly formal set piece. At the end of that set piece, there was an alley that was in an angle that then got you, if you walk 3 minutes, into a souk that was all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So even in the project in Christie Cookie, that the sketch with the 3 towers shape a space that is completely regular. And then we made that regular because then you have other bits. So what we like doing is to have both. Because in the moment that you have both, the regular feels more regular and the regular feels more irregular, and then the experience intensifies when you move from one to another.
Right. Okay, I'm done with my selfishness now. Any questions from the audience? I'm not allowed to point, so people have mics who will walk around and find you.
Hi there. Thanks for your presentation. It was a really fascinating, I think, look at your approach to formal design and sort of these in both the buildings and the spaces around them. But at the beginning of your lecture, you sort of alluded to a programmatic concern as well when you sort of diagrammed, I think it was retail on the bottom, office or commercial on the sort of middle bits, and then residential all up on top. And I'm wondering, what is the relationship between program and your form, and how does one inform the other? Because that typical diagram that you presented at the beginning almost seems suburban in many ways, in the sort of concentration of certain activities in certain parts of the building, rather than a sort of more heterogeneous distribution of functions within a building.
That's a difficult and tricky question. I mean, in 2 different levels. I think that in the practice, we have some people that are more concerned about uses and program, and some of us that are a bit more skeptical about program and use as a driver of form. It's interesting when you see types that we like I don't know, Victorian warehouses or palazzo, how the typology is almost agnostic of the use, because our buildings that have changed their uses and so on. So that's one school of thought. And others that then sometimes we are incredibly specific to the use and so on. So I'm not responding to your question just yet. I'm leaning more to the agnostic in the use and so on. So because I think that the program is a drive, sometimes a driver form of a secondary order. But having said that, or disclosing that particular personal preference, I think that the bit in which we care more about the uses, not so much obviously, sometimes we are playing with residential towers, sometimes playing with the office towers that comes from clients, and what is the nature of the commission, is more in how the buildings land. And there are another 150 slides that I had to cut down because it was getting into too long. And then there's another round of aspects in relation to the tall buildings and in relation to the definition of the ground plane. And buildings that have no backs, how you deal with rubbish trucks, and that is a favorite in this city, the type Gs and PUDOs and so on, that then generates a sort of part of this picturesque approach that has to do with uses and so on. The diagram that you are mentioning, it is something that then was done as sort of a master plan level in a very diagrammatic manner, that then when we move into architecture, I was not part of a master plan team for that project. I was enjoying the team to do architecture in that case. And it was immediately we started questioning that diagram that we produce as a practice doing the master plan, because then and hence my part of my skepticism with the program. What was for me as the architect of a building crucial was not so much the program, was the urban grain. How to make big things go into that middle grain that I was talking about, hence the strategy of the fragmentation. Having said that, then what all happened in the ground plane, I was incredibly worried that the building landed, that the residential building landed and have an address that were clear, that the residential office building landed and have a clear address, and then that I have active uses all around. That's for the next lecture and the next 200 slides for the next time.
I was curious about the building codes that city impose on you, and when have they been impeding on your design, and are they welcome constraints?
Sorry, so repeat the beginning of the question?
Building codes in cities.
We have this series of, we organized a conference in our practice called City Makers. We did one here last year. And we have explored different themes, development models, legacies of the 20th century, universities, developers, transport-oriented communities, and so on. And there is one that I have always wanted to do that has to do with regulations and codes, and how codes shape cities and so on. And I mean, we will need way more time, but we probably will need a couple of bottles of wines to talk about regulations and city making. There is a book called London Unique City by Stiller Rasmussen. It's a tiny book, it's fascinating by it, because it talks about the difference between Paris and London, that we're developing as cities in parallel, having more or less the same size and so on, but one has Napoleonic code, a Napoleonic law, and one has no constitution and is kind of the experiential one. And the way in which that influenced first the code of cities, so in basically the planning system. The planning system in Paris is regulatory. Basically, the city and the government and the planners establish this is the order. In this case, what Haussmann said, 7 stories, off you go, boulevards, these are the types, and you get a city with an incredible amount of consistency. You cannot go taller. You have rules. And that has generated an incredibly powerful type of city, and that's then what you get in a regulatory planning system. In London, what you get is a discretionary planning system. What happens is that parties that are the client, the design team, the planner, come together to define what is the right solution for each occasion. So should the building be this high or that high? Or should it be? And so basically each occasion, then basically you go one by one. What that generates is then a very heterogeneous city that you have. And on the planning system, and here you have the tall building guidelines and the mid-rise guidelines, and then these cities are shaped by that, absolutely shaped by that. And my wife is an architect that is way more intelligent than me. She's also interested in doing a history of architecture that is a history of regulation. So because in a sense, we architects follow that shape cities in many respects, and then we play within the constraints and parameters that the guidelines gave us.
One more question.
London Unique City by Rasmussen, Stalen Rasmussen.
Hello.
The Scandinavian architect from the early 20th century.
I'm not sure.
Hi, thank you so much for a fascinating...
It's not on.
Can you hear me? Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation, and I speak as a member of the public. I don't have any connection to architecture other than I live in the city, and I've lived in London, and I've traveled to all the places that you mentioned in your presentation. My question relates to the psychology of colors and to what extent it is a consideration when you design spaces. And I ask that because you mentioned in the presentation the TD towers, and that's where I work. And I find myself a lot of times, looking up at the sky and noticing the buildings, the TD tower, the BMO tower, the Scotiabank tower. And honestly, the TD towers depress me. When I look at the BMO tower, I feel hopeful. And then when I look at the Scotiabank tower, I feel excited. So I wonder, and now that you mentioned in your presentation that might actually have been deliberate, the creation of that space in that way might have been deliberate, that I am in awe that that's a possibility. So yeah, my question is, psychology of colors, how much do you consider that?
Well, a lot. We like color, it's interesting when we were doing Christie Cookie and so on. So we did this. Let's start with Miss Van der Rohe and so on. I mean, as I saw any self-respecting architect, you like Miss and you respect Miss and so on. But I don't. Let's say it which is a respectful way of putting this. I don't get moved by Miss Van der Rohe. I admire, but in a sense, it's this kind of the strength of order leave so many things out. So can you imagine putting a shop in the ground floor of a Dominion Center? Those towers are just landing elegantly, but at the same time, very kind of in a very sterile way. It's incredibly elegant, but at the same time, exclude a lot of things that are part of cities and so on. That is my issues with Miss Van der Rohe. And part of that is obviously the imposition of this strong color, this black thing. It's incredibly elegant. I mean, it obviously appeals to one side of my mind. But on the other hand, kind of as partially, it's not my cup of tea. And in a sense, in our work, and more, we are interested in this kind of color and warmth and so on. In Christie Cookie, we did a fantastic slide that was, you have this thing here called window wall. Yeah. That we have we kind of got used to, having been here for almost working for 10 years, and we did a slide that was then the towers in Humber Bay and Mimico and so on. They're all variations of gray and blue and glass and so on, and that creates a tonality of architecture that was part of a local vernacular. But then if you went to the houses in Mimico, the houses, they're all brick, and they're warm colors, and they have reds and browns and yellows and so on. So what we wanted to do was taking the scale of the buildings and the warmth of the houses, so that then you have a little bit more of a variation and a warmth, because if you are going to have very tall buildings, perhaps black and only black is not the right choice. And then you have variation. That is what kind of cities are a little bit about. And we have some. I think we have some green buildings there, and we like that notion of variation, but particularly warmth that some of these materials can give you. And metal buildings sometimes are harder. Even the metal buildings that we did in the one that red and silver are trying to introduce that, so that you get a sense of variation.
Great. I think we're going to have to close now, but you can linger here and in the commons outside. Maybe Alfredo will be willing to answer a few more questions, but I do need to bring him to dinner.
Yeah.
Because he wants some food and wine.
Indeed.
But I just want a few just housekeeping things. I just want to let you all know that there is an exhibition towards the entrance that's called Eyeball, which is an annual survey of the visual studies undergraduate students here at the Daniels, if you'd like to take a look. don't forget next week that there's the Visual Studies Pro seminar that I mentioned with Peter Morin as the guest speaker. And just this is the last week that you can see in the gallery behind me, the Larry Wayne Richards Gallery, which has an exhibition of the Howarth Wright Graduate Fellowship students' work. These are people who were given a fellowship in order to study and look at Frank Lloyd Wright's work, and then to produce some of their own work that is riffing on their response to Wright. So, but with that, I would just like to thank Alfredo so much for this evening.
Thank you.
It was great to have you here, great to hear your thoughts on architecture and see your work, so thank you so
Thank you
much.
for inviting me. Thank you.